Welcome to Rethinking Economics, a Henry George School podcast series. Rethinking Economics is all about questioning the core foundations of economics. This series questions economic orthodoxy to better understand the forces shaping our society and the world. Together, we'll interrogate things like the efficacy of economic models, if conventional wisdom is always correct, and why the ideas and concepts you may learn about in textbooks may lead you astray. Today's discussion was recorded in August of 2025 between me, Nathan Greene, and our returning guest, Dr. Ansel Schiavone. Before we get into today's discussion, I have some updates for you all regarding the show. I have a little bit of bittersweet news to share. This is actually my final episode hosting the podcast. After 178 episodes, I'm unfortunately moving on to a new role. I'm an inherently curious person, and I love to learn through conversation. This podcast presented me a unique opportunity for me to meet many people with interesting ideas and gain insight into how they perceive the world. While I didn't always agree with them, it was always a fascinating conversation nonetheless. I got to speak with thinkers I love, have read about, and even got to reconnect with some I had already met. Needless to say, this was an incredible and unique opportunity. By the time you're hearing this, I will have already begun my new job. My last day with the Henry George School was September 14th, and this will be published shortly after. I hope you all loved listening to this podcast just as much as I enjoyed making it. And trust me when I say, I really did love making this show. And while it may not be me behind the mic, the Henry George School will continue to put out the content that you have come to love and expect. The show will be taking a break until next year. They will let you know ahead of time when the show will be back and what kind of content they'll be putting out. I'm not too sure when that will be, but I know I'll be listening, and I hope you will be too. If you want to keep up with me and my work, I will leave some links below to my Twitter, LinkedIn, and Substack. I can't promise I'll be very active on either, though, since this new role will be quite consuming, but a follow is always appreciated and free. I cannot thank everyone who gave me this opportunity enough, from the listeners to my coworker Kuba, who helped me put these episodes out, to Andrada, who trusted me enough to manage the show myself. I am sad that I am leaving, but I can't wait to see, and maybe I should say hear, what the podcast does next. I hope all of you are just as excited. Now, enough of the updates, let's get into the show. Dr. Schiavone is a macroeconomist whose research focuses on inequality and structural change. He has worked as a research assistant at the Institute for New Economic Thinking in the International Labor Organization. He has published numerous articles in journals such as Economic Modeling, Metroeconomica, and Regional Studies. Dr. Schiavone is an assistant professor at St. John's, where he teaches microeconomics, macroeconomics, and the economics of poverty and inequality. He earned his bachelor's from Dennison University and his Ph.D. from the University of Utah, both in economics. Together, we discussed why workers are receiving a smaller and smaller share of what they produce, some of the policies recently passed to try and correct this inequality, and why certain critiques of globalization may not be unfair. This is your host, Nathan Greene, signing off for the last time. Stay curious and keep searching for the truth. It may not be what you expect, but nothing ever is in this world. As always, we hope you enjoyed this talk, and please make sure to check back on our page every week for a brand new episode. Dr. Ansel Schiavone, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
So I'm really glad that we could have a labor economist come and talk to us so shortly after Labor Day. And so I think it's useful to understand kind of what spurs our guests' interest in what they research or what they work on. So I just wanted to hear from you. You've written a lot about labor and labor economics. What spurred your interest in labor economics, and why is labor such an important lens for you to understand the economy?
Well, most of my work has been focused, I should say pretty much all of my work has been focused on the US. And, in looking at macroeconomics within the United States, it's pretty hard not to see inequality as kind of the at least one of the most important areas, and social and economic issues. And so, with that kind of being my primary focus in my research and in my teaching, then kind of the natural next step is like, well, where are the major sources of inequality? within within the U.S. economy, and so then that kind of naturally leads to obviously questions of wage inequality that are outcomes of the labor market, but then also forms of income that exist outside of the labor market. And so, I guess when I to answer your question as to why labor economics or the study of labor market interests me so much is, well, the simple answer is that it's the most important market within our economy, right? Most people, the vast majority of people, earn the vast majority of their income in this thing we call the labor market, whatever that might be. And so therefore the health or the state of said labor market is a very important thing to look at. Now, in my opinion, and this is sort of splitting hairs and going down a rabbit hole, using the term the labor market is similar to using, say, a term the stock market, right? That is that it tends to move in different directions, but it really is more of a collection of 10, 100, 1,000, and different markets, and people's experiences are very different depending on where they are within the labor market. And so a lot of my work, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a second, comes or involves sort of splitting apart or breaking apart this definition of the labor market and understanding its implications and why different people have such different experiences within the U.S. quote unquote labor market.
So now let's dive right into your work. So on page 2 of How Structural Change Can Lead to Inequality and Stagnation, you state your thesis, and I believe I'm getting this right in quoting, in steady state, the adverse effect of structural change on labor productivity leads to stagnation. So now I'm going to tell you what I understood from that, and you try to tell me how wrong I'm getting it. So what I took from that is that as we develop economically, we start to see employment shift from more of a goods-based economy and over towards services, which can tend to be a little bit more unproductive or inefficient, which results in a aggregate drag on the economy, making it less productive as a whole. And so then when we have uneven kind of bargaining power between employer and employee, we start to see a negative impact on wages, which can then make inequality worse. So tell me, what did I get wrong and what did I get right there?
I think you got pretty much everything correct there, and so I guess I will just kind of add points of clarification or detail. First off, maybe for our listeners who are not familiar with this term, structural change, as the name suggests, refers to change in the structures of employment and production within an economy. So, this concept of steady state, so to speak, is sort of the opposite of structural change, right? Structural change is this, as you said, this idea that, for example, the U.S. economy over the past, let's say, 6 decades has transformed from a goods-producing economy with roughly 1/3 of workers employed in manufacturing to now a service-based economy where now you have maybe 10% of workers or fewer employed in manufacturing. Now, that is just one flavor of structural change. We can look to an earlier period of U.S. economic history where the economy was transitioning from an agrarian, agricultural, rural-based production to industrialized economy, again, reaching its kind of peak sometime in the post-war period. So structural change, therefore, is just referring to any process whereby people are moving from one industry to another. People are moving, probably because of that, moving from one place to another. And a lot of this, of course, is driven by technology. Now, there are debates as to what actually drives structural change, and the answer is it's a lot of different things. But technology, of course, is a big one. You can imagine that as an industry becomes more productive, depending on the type of technical change, that industry might demand fewer workers, and therefore those workers that are displaced then look for work in other parts of the economy. So if we focus in on the type of structural change that the U.S. has been experiencing, again, over the past 60 or so years, we can describe this as deindustrializing structural change, as the name suggests, moving from manufacturing towards services. Now, the reality is there's a few points of clarification that we should make, as we kind of say what the implications of said structural change is for workers. First off, manufacturing historically has been sort of the backbone of the American middle class, as we'd say. This is particularly true among workers that are in sort of non-urban centers. Typically, these jobs are high paying, unionized. And what we've seen is that not only have we seen a decline in the number of workers employed in these jobs, but the nature of these jobs have changed as well. The rate of unionization has declined basically monotonically since the beginning of the 1980s, and wages have, but and not monotonically, but have stagnated. Now, what this reflects, of course, is structural change. These individuals moving from manufacturing to services. Now, the reason behind this, again, partially is technology driven, but it also has to do with policy, right? The globalization that occurred in the 1990s, and then particularly with China's entrance into the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, meant that, well, now domestic manufacturers are competing not just with other domestic manufacturers, but with manufacturers around the globe. And because of differences in standards of living and kind of prevailing wages between, say, the United States and Vietnam or China, then you have pretty harsh competition. Now, those are kind of the causal forces behind that. But that story of the decline of manufacturing runs parallel to the story of rising inequality. Now, of course, in order for something to be a cause, it must occur before the effect is observed. And in many cases, we do see that, beginning basically in the 1960s, this decline of manufacturing, and we see inequality really beginning to rise sometime in the 1970s. Now, that's not to suggest that the decline of manufacturing is the sole driver of inequality. In fact, we can see empirically that it is not the sole driver of inequality, but it is a major contributor, and it is a major contributor particularly in the, say, 1970s until about the late 1990s, maybe turn of the century. Now, we can talk a little bit about the mechanisms behind that, and some of the things that kind of we, and I say we, my co-authors and I have worked on and are still working on. But to get back to your question of structural change and this question of the steady state, which I think you're kind of probing at, yes, a steady state, right, is a theoretical concept or construct that's used by economists. And I probably share your sentiment, and maybe it's the sentiment of many of the listeners here, that a steady state is not really something that actually exists, right? It is a way, it's kind of a thought experiment, so to speak. But in the same way, you can also say that about most things that exist within theoretical economics. I'm about to teach a course in microeconomics that, of course, deals with utility functions, production functions, and supply and demand curves, none of which actually really exist in the real world, but they're a way of thinking about the real world and trying to simplify. They're in other words, they're abstract models. The reason that thinking about structural change in a steady state is important or useful is that it allows us to kind of decouple a couple, moving parts and examine those moving parts, individually, right? So on the one hand, you have a process of structural change whereby you have workers that are moving from manufacturing to services. Now, services is a highly polarized industry, meaning you have doctors and lawyers that are part of the service sector, but you also have people who are waiting tables or gas station attendants that are all part of the service sector. And, there's high polarization, of course.
So it's not just accountants and lawyers.
Exactly, right. And it's also not just gas station attendants and servers. Now, the point is, right, is that process of structural change means that, on its surface, it seems that you have, workers that are shifting from high-paying jobs to low-paying jobs, which is, can be true. It also means that you have a shift towards a more polarized labor force. It also means that you have, a shift from an occupation that, yes, is high paying, but also creates lots of value, right? That is a large driver of value. And so in doing so also creates large profits, right? It's highly productive industry or sector of the economy that is benefits greatly from technical change, right? And at least until recently, we've seen that the services are a little bit more difficult to automate. And so it has implications for GDP growth as well. And so let's I guess I'll stop there because I can talk a lot about this, and maybe we'll dig in deeper with some subsequent questions.
Yeah, sure. No, so just to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on your work. So you mentioned the goods and services based economy. You talk about productive versus unproductive roles. And you say that unproductive roles tend to be service based, manufacturing and more goods jobs tend to be more productive. You also note that the more productive goods based roles tend to have a greater share of the output. But then you also note that states with more service-based roles, somewhere like California, tends to, again, have that kind of lower share of income produced. But I think for listeners, that could be a little bit confusing because when they think of a wealthy state like California, they think tech jobs, high wages. When they think of a more manufacturing-based state, we'll pick a random one, say Alabama, they see workers having lower wages there. So is this more than just wages, or is there a little bit of a disconnect in the way people are thinking about these roles?
Sure, yeah. So let's maybe before I answer that, take a step back. So in that particular paper, and the many of the papers that I've worked on, the primary variable of interest is something called the labor share, right? So the labor share of income is a ratio, or it's a percentage, and basically what it looks at is for every dollar of value that's created, or in other words, for every dollar of GDP, how many cents of that dollar goes to labor, right? And then the residual is, well, that goes to capital, right? If we think that all income is either received by people in the form of wages or by people in the form of profits, then you can divide, national income into those two bins. Now, the reason that the labor share of income is important, and I show this in my class, my inequality class that I teach very early on, is that, and there's a very nice graph by Piketty. I think it's figure 8.10 for listeners who are familiar with Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century,
I
or
have a
in the
great
20th century, I
memory.
should say. Um, I actually looked it up before this, so I don't know it off the top of my head. But if you're curious about the figure I'm referencing, that's the one, and you can find it online. But basically, what the figure shows is on the x-axis, it shows the income distribution. So imagine lining people up from poorest to richest, and then it shows two lines on that graph. It shows the percentage of those individuals' income that comes from labor versus capital, right? Those two potential sources of income. Now, unsurprisingly, as you move from poorest to richest on that graph, what you see is that the share of income that comes from labor declines, and therefore the share of income that comes from capital increases, right? In
Right.
other words, lower income people tend to earn more of their income through wages, and higher income people tend to earn more of their income through capital.
I
And
see.
so therefore, if you come back to the concept of the labor share, a decline in the labor share, a decline in the number in the percentage of every dollar produced that's going to labor implies that you have a shift in income towards those in the top percentiles of the income distribution. So the labor share of income, therefore, in my opinion, and my co-authors, of course, share this belief, is one of the most important variables for studying the dynamics of income inequality. Okay, so with that being said, then what the paper that you're referencing looks at is it says, well, we have, of course, measures for national income and total compensation at the national level, and so we can look at the U.S. labor share, and there are a variety of different ways that you can measure it, and different ways that different authors measure it, but it's somewhere between, let's say, 40% and 60%. Um, but the interesting thing about the labor share, and the reason that the labor share is of interest to economists and has become quite interesting, is that it has been declining and has declined significantly over the past 40 or so years. Beginning again sometime in the 1970s, it has declined fairly substantially until probably about 2019, right? COVID and the post-COVID period, it's still a little bit unclear what the dynamics are. So what that would suggest, of course, is that for every dollar produced in the United States, less of that money is going to labor than it was, say, 40 years ago. Now, we are fortunate, and I am fortunate to study the U.S. because the U.S. is really truly the envy of the world in terms of the quality and the quantity of the data that we have, and so we can compute the labor share not just for the U.S., but we can compute it for individual states. We can compute it for individual industries. We can compute it for individual industries within individual states, right? And so we can start to pull apart the labor share and say, well, what is driving the labor share decline, right? There are different ways in which the labor share can decline, and
Hmm.
the different dynamics have different, normative implications. That is, they mean different things, right? And they can be good or bad.
Right.
So an example of that, right? And I mean, you would say, okay, well, a decline, ceteris paribus, right? A decline in the labor share is bad for workers. Okay. But you might be, kind of surprised to know that if you look at the labor share, the average labor share in manufacturing, it's actually lower than that in services, right?
Hmm.
The reason being is because manufacturing is highly productive, and so workers are paid more, but they also produce more output, right? And so therefore, despite the fact that average wages might be higher in manufacturing, right, the labor share is actually lower. And so when you have a process of structural change from manufacturing to, say, to lower paying services, you actually have a pro labor share effect occurring. That is, all else being equal, structural change appears to positively impact the labor share, despite the fact that workers are probably worse off being employed in lower wage service jobs than they are in manufacturing, at least from the perspective of wages, right? So that is, an example of why, just looking at the labor share, or at least looking at aggregate labor share values, doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. We can think about, a similar reality occurring in the tech sector in states like California, New York, and Texas, right? If you look at the tech industry, first off, while the tech industry plays an outsized role in terms of GDP, its employment is still very, very little, right? It's very, very low relative to the size of, say, New York or California or Texas. It's a very small percentage of workers that are actually employed in tech. But in tech, you have a similar thing happening, right? We all are aware that tech jobs tend to pay very well,
Oh,
but
yeah.
the relative to the value that is produced within that industry, the worker share of income is relatively low, right? So, again, it might nominally look bad for a state to have a growing tech sector because the labor share declines, but again, those tend to be high-paying jobs. Now, there are a couple of points of clarification that I want to put on this term productive, or as we use in our papers, progressive. Right? We say that an industry is productive or progressive as opposed to stagnant. Now, this is saying nothing about the workers who work in that or their ability by any means. This terminology actually comes from a paper by William Baumol that was written in the 1960s. And the basic idea is that an activity can be thought of as progressive or productive if there is a systematic way in which technology increases the output per worker, right? So you can imagine that if you give a manufacturing worker new machinery, that they're going to become much more productive, and that happens systematically over time. Versus stagnant activities, right, quote unquote stagnant, you could think of as, say, playing music at a bar. That's also a form of production. We can think you're creating a value and creating a good, and that, or a service rather, and that creates value. But there's no real technology that can suddenly quadruple the output of the trumpet player, right? At least not, and
Right.
not you can't do that and keep the quality of music the same. And so, essentially, my point there is that in activities that are, or industries that are progressive, you have this kind of natural tendency for output to increase, right? And even if wages are higher in that industry, because of that tendency, you can see that eventually labor shares in those industries tend to lag behind those industries that are largely labor intensive and have relatively little technical change or technological progress.
I see. Well, this is just a completely side thought, but no, the term productive versus unproductive might need a little bit of changing just because, of course, every profession, the employees are productive. And it kind of reminds me of the skilled versus unskilled workers kind of conversation as well, just because all roles do require some sort of skill. It's not like no job is completely de-skilled. And so, yeah, I think there does need to be a little bit of a terminology shift in economics, especially in labor.
Which is why I prefer the term progressive versus stagnant activities. Again, it has some connotation, I guess, but I mean
Right.
that's what we're referring to is the technological progress is or progress that is present within those different activities.
Right. Now, I think it's always helpful to kind of be able to translate economists speak a little bit more palatably to some of the people who are trying to listen to the economists and take heed from them. So, just staying on your research a little bit more, you say in one of them, this paper presents a classical Keynesian one sector model of labor constrained growth that explains secular stagnation as the result of structural change. You've already talked about structural change and what that means. Can you maybe break down what a classical Keynesian one sector model of labor constrained growth means for our listeners?
Sure, I could do that without maybe making everybody want to close out their Spotify app.
No,
Um,
well, no, it's because you talk about a few different economists in this. You talk about Keynes, you talk about Baumol, and you talk about Arthur Lewis, and they all have very interesting ideas about how countries develop in regards to their labor market. But I think obviously, like these concepts and terms, they're very hard to understand. And so just being able to break them down and understand what each one means is very helpful to the conversation.
right. So yeah. So the world, I guess, of Keynes. Keynes, of course, was this prominent economist that thought about things differently in a time where the world was changing, and many of the institutions that we have to this day, or at least have up until now, are derived, at least in part from this kind of new way of thinking about the economy. And I don't have time to go into all of the ways in which Keynes revolutionized the discipline. But the reality is then, as Keynes' legacy was then, picked up by various students of his and other people who were inspired by his work. You have these different kind of camps of post Keynesians and neo Keynesians and so on and so forth. Now, from a theoretical perspective, I guess the way that I and my co-authors would describe kind of our camp or our way in which we view the world, which we think is a way that Keynes understood the world as well, is that demand within the economy is obviously one of the most important things, right? Effective demand was really kind of the thing that Keynes saw as what had been ignored previously, right? It was the idea that, well, if workers don't have wages or they don't have sufficient purchasing power, then the kind of inherent cycle within the economy breaks down, because ultimately it is the consumers, the workers, that are buying the goods that are being produced, and so on and so forth. That's just a general tenet of Keynesianism. Now, going back to my co-authors and I, one belief that we have, or one kind of addition to that, right, which is sometimes overlooked by others that also call themselves Keynesians, is that while effective demand is of course important, it is it's kind of a chicken and egg question. It also requires profit incentives, right, in order for investment decisions to be made, right. Individuals, particularly capitalists, are making decisions and seeking profits in that regard. And so we generally tend to describe the world as profit led in the short run and demand led in the long run. That is, that if we think about kind of in the short run, that is in the period of the business cycle, right? Economic growth is driven by profit incentives, right? It is driven by people's belief that they're going to be able to earn profits on whatever decision that they are making with respect to their business. But in the long run, right, the long run idea is more of kind of what we think of as Keynes' contribution of effective demand, and that is that, well, in the long run, if you don't have strong effective demand, that can put a hindrance, or that can put a constraint on economic growth, right? One, because I guess most importantly is because people don't have the purchasing power to buy the goods that they are producing. So again, it's all kind of Keynesian ideas, but amalgamated in different ways. And um, the world, of course, has changed quite a bit since Keynes was alive and writing. And Keynes's famous prognostication that the world of the 21st century is going to be one in which we only work 3 or 4 hours a week, and that the kind of the economic problem has been solved. Doesn't unfortunately seem to have turned out to be correct. Although there that answer might lie more in distribution than it does in our productivity, because our productivity has of course increased a lot since Keynes' day.
Right.
So I think maybe probably that is as far into the weeds as we should get on that particular topic. And if you have further questions, we can dive into those.
No, I think that's a perfect segue to the next section of questions. You talked about why we haven't had a 15-hour or 3-hour work week, or why we haven't seen a decreasing work week in the amount of days that we work. So I'm curious, why is that? I mean, since Keynes's time, I don't know the exact figure, but I'm sure the economy has more than quintupled or something to that effect. We are more productive. We have these extremely efficient technologies like ChatGPT that are now just beginning to be integrated into the workplace. We've seen a just tremendous development in the global economy, in the US in particular. So, how come these benefits aren't being translated to workers for that matter? Do institutions have a role to play in this? You talked a little bit about union membership. How does that play into the equation?
Yeah, well, I think to answer your question, it is a good question, right? Why have we not arrived at this sort of utopia that Keynes described? I think there's two reasons, and the one is that we have materially much better lives, right? In real terms, we consume more, much more than people in the 1940s or the 1950s, and so, of course, if you're going to consume more, then you have to produce more, and so, in part, that can explain part of the reason why the average work week has not declined, at least not to the degree that the Keynes thought possible. Um, the other answer, of course, is distribution. That is that, well, if you have greater output, but that output is less equally distributed, increasingly less equally distributed, as we've seen be the case beginning in the 1970s, then again, that can have the effect of if the benefits are not being spread equally, of course, then we shouldn't expect necessarily everyone to be able to suddenly enjoy this reduced work week that Keynes described. Now, your question about institutions is a good one. The word institution in and of itself, I think, needs a little bit of decomposing, right? What it means. I mean, in my mind, institutions is sort of just a word that economists slap onto anything that can't be neatly described using say our traditional theoretical tools. But when I think of institutions, and I think that you're alluding to too, particularly in labor markets, I'm thinking about things such as collective bargaining or unions, for example, for that matter. Now,
Not the institution of marriage.
right,
Not the
yeah,
conversation we're having.
right. There are many uses of that term, but let's focus specifically on unions and collective bargaining. Again, if you look at this decline in the labor share of income and the more general rise in inequality that began sometime in the 1970s, obviously, they say that we all are familiar with the saying that correlation does not imply causation, but I always like to add to that while that is true, correlation is a necessary condition for causation. That is, that in order for it to be a possible explanation, that correlation must exist. Now, if we look at union membership in the United States, that correlation is quite strong. So, union membership reached its peak in 1981, and it's kind of that peak was then marked by the election of Ronald Reagan, the PATCO strike, the takeover of the National Labor's Relation Board, and so on and so forth, right? That is sort of the simplified story, and that is, the story that if you believe the institutional explanation for the decline in the labor share of income and the rise of inequality, right, you see that as kind of the catalyst and then a move both from both sides of the aisle in American politics against organized labor, right? So, and that is, at least in part, a relevant story, right? The unions, of course, are a very important mechanism, right? They allow workers to bargain collectively, and we all know that, a group is stronger than an individual when it comes to demands for wages and so forth. But there's also kind of a structural reason, right? Leaving aside politics and sentiments regarding unions, there's also a kind of a structural reason as to why union membership has declined, and that lies in structural change. Manufacturing was a very natural sector to have unionization because workers worked closely together, right, within plants, within large facilities. That had traditionally had forms of worker organization and collective bargaining, and as you've seen that process of structural change occur, now people are entering a much larger and much more heterogeneous service sector where some workers work completely online, some workers work in small shops, some workers work in the gig economy, and all of this has made it such that collective bargaining and organization is just a more difficult task. In addition to that, of course, the process of globalization that has occurred, the opening of the U.S. to the world's imports, so to speak, right, has also in some ways undermined the ability of organized labor, at least in particularly in tradable sectors of the U.S. economy. One could make the argument, and people have made the argument, that you're a worker that is concerned about your job maybe being shipped overseas, you're perhaps less likely to vote to unionize because your fear is that unionization will be met with a relocation of your job, right? And in fact, we do see that there is evidence of that, not just overseas, but between states as well. We know we have the laboratories, the 50 laboratories of democracy, right? The U.S. is sort of unique in that regard of quite heterogeneous labor laws between different states, and so even within the United States, you've seen shifts of manufacturing employment from the traditionally unionized Northeast and Midwest states towards the Southeast, where unions were traditionally less prevalent. So institutions play certainly a big role, but not the only role, right? And I think that one thing that my co-authors and I all agree on is that this story of rising inequality within the United States is very complex. And you point to just one particular part of that story, you're probably only going to be partially correct.
So you touched upon something interesting there with offshoring and globalization. And one criticism of globalization, I think that is somewhat fair, is that it kind of creates this race to the bottom effect in terms of wages for manufacturing jobs. Is that a fair characterization of the critique, or do you think there's something that those critics or proponents of those criticisms are missing?
I believe that it is a fair critique, right? I mean, if we look at, say, Ricardo's theory of trade, right? Ricardo's theory of trade says that countries should and ultimately will specialize in that which they have a comparative advantage in, right? Of course, Ricardo's theory of trade is largely formulated in agrarian production, where one's competitive advantage is determined by geography, right? It's determined by how well a particular crop or a particular resource can be produced in a particular location. But of course, in an industrialized economy, in an industrialized world, the comparative advantage that certain regions or certain economies have oftentimes is just the cost of labor, right? And that has to do both with population size, demographic trends, and also regulation. Now, the reality is, of course, too, and I think that this is an important point, that if we think about the overly simplified concept that there are two inputs to production, labor and capital, we see that increasingly especially in a digital world, but even before then, capital is a much more mobile input than is labor. You can literally go on Fidelity and move capital from one part of the world to another with a touch of a button, right, or with your thumb. But of course, the movement of labor from one side of the world to another is a much more difficult and arduous process. And so, therefore, it kind of comes as no surprise that as if capital moved from one side of the world to another, there's going to be labor that is left behind that had traditionally relied on being paired with that capital, and that capital has since left. So I think it's it's a fair critique. I mean, this is in a positive sense, as in just I think that's how a correct way to view the world. Not saying that necessarily globalization has been bad or good, right? It's been both. There's been clearly benefits and drawbacks if we just look at the perspective of, say, the average individual within the United States. Lower consumer goods, a incredibly low and stable rate of inflation, at least prior to 2020. But at the same time, that came at the expense of significant job loss in particularly productive segments of the U.S. economy.
So staying on this topic a little bit, I know that Milton Friedman was very critical of union membership, and he said that part of the reason why Americans started to buy fewer American cars was because the price was too high because the auto sector was very unionized, and then we begun to see a lot more cars coming from places like Japan or South Korea. And I recognize that Milton Friedman came from a time where you didn't have like very specialized, or you had a very segmented value chain within even just like automobiles. But I think you would argue that without these unions, that labor is going to lose their share of the income that is created. Do you think that that is an unfair characterization by Milton Friedman, or do you think that he is right, even if it does lead to a worse outcome for laborers?
Well, here's where I'll come back to where I say the way in which I kind of view the flavor of Keynesianism that I tend to embody, and that is basically to sit on a fence here, and that is that we can think of the world. Okay, if we think of the economy, right, the economy is driven by demand in the long run, but profit incentives in the short run, right? And so both of those arguments, right, that unions put a burden on producers and therefore prevent or discourage investment in say U.S. manufacturing, that's probably true. But also the erosion of unions and therefore the erosion of workers' purchasing power also erodes domestic demand, right? It erodes the purchasing power of the American consumer, which we know is a very important driver of the U.S. economy. And so, both of those views are correct. It is quite literally a double-edged sword. I of course tend to think that and this maybe goes against Keynes' famous saying that in the long run we're all dead. Right. But the reality is that the long run we will we will eventually get to whatever the long run is, and if effective demand is continually overlooked for the sake of short run profits, right? Eventually that will probably come back to affect us in a negative way. Some might say that we're already observing that. Some might say that we still have a long ways to go until the American consumer is completely depleted, and I think I probably fall somewhere in the middle of that. In particular, what we've seen in the past few years, particularly since COVID, is some interesting reversals in particular trends and stronger wage growth, particularly in industries that prior had seen pretty consistent declines in average earnings. I'm talking specifically in manufacturing. Obviously, that opens up a whole nother can of worms in terms of what U.S. policy should be moving forward in terms of imports and exports. But yeah, I mean it's a very complicated and complex thing that I don't pretend to understand.
Now, the world is a complex place, but I think having like analytical frameworks like this kind of helps us try to understand it or simplify it a little bit. For our listeners hearing the term labor share of income for the first time, kind of regardless of which state has the greater labor share of income, what would a 2 to 4% swing in the labor share of income mean for everyday people? kind of like how would that translate to
Right.
their standing
So
or their economic well-being?
your lived experience, probably not very much, right? And again, this is where there is an important distinction to say that the labor share is more importantly a measure of the macroeconomic distribution of income between labor and capital.
Hmm.
It does not imply necessarily, if a decline in the labor share does not imply necessarily that you have a decline in nominal or even real wages within a particular industry, right? I use the example of manufacturing, for example, as well as technology, right?
Hmm.
If a company becomes, if a company adopts a new technology that makes it 10% more makes its workers 10% more productive, and the workers each get a 5% raise, well, the labor share of income of those workers has declined, but their lived experiences, well, they now have 5% higher purchasing power, right? Now, that is one possibility. Another possibility is that a company decides that it is going to cut wages, right, or it's going to reduce wages for new hires without increasing output, and therefore then you have a decline in the labor share that is occurring because of stagnation or reduction in real terms of wages, and therefore the lived experience of that individual would be worse, right? The economic conditions of that individual would be worse. So 4% swing in the labor share of income. It really depends on the circumstances within which you're talking about, right? But if you look at it at the aggregate level, right, if you say, well, the labor share of income within, say, the United States has declined by some 20 percentage points over the past 40 years, you can imagine that it is, some combination of both of those two scenarios playing out, productivity gains and worker wages not increasing with those productivity gains, right? So in other words, you can imagine it as maybe the pie is growing, but the workers' share of that pie is shrinking. And it sort of depends on which of those two things people are ultimately concerned with. And that is really a social and political question, right? At what point do people stop being so concerned with their absolute purchasing power and start becoming more concerned with relative purchasing power
Right.
in terms of inequality? My personal opinion is that we are reaching a point at which it is increasingly difficult to ignore the relative that relative comparison.
It's unsustainable, would you say?
I don't know whether it's sustainable or not. What I will say is that if you study history and you look at particular examples in history, rising inequality is not generally a harbinger for good things to come.
Right.
Not always is it, right? It's not always, it doesn't always mean that it ends in catastrophe. But inequality has the tendency to tear at the fabric of society. It becomes increasingly difficult for people to consider themselves part of the same polity if economic inequality is so vast. So
Right.
I can't predict the future. It is certainly possible that the level of inequality that exists in the United States today is perfectly sustainable, and maybe inequality will continue to rise without any issues. Or it is perfectly possible that we are well past the threshold of what is sustainable level of
Right.
inequality, and that we will bear the consequences of that. I don't know the answer to that, but
Right.
we can look at history for lessons, right, and indications.
Right. Now, perhaps sustainable wasn't the right word. Maybe tolerable might have been a better word. Could people tolerate this for much longer? And I do think it is starting to be a little bit of a good explanation as to why we are seeing the polarizing politics that we're experiencing today. I think a key part of it is kind of like this anti-establishment or going against the system kind of sentiment. And for a lot of people, who are like on the more polar opposite sides of the spectrum, I can understand why, if you're somebody who's living in rural Alabama, why you see New York billionaires and you are upset with the system. And it doesn't seem like it will be much tolerable for much longer. And I think we're starting to see some of that change play out into politics. But to turn more towards politics now without getting too political, you talked about the pie growing and people's share of the pie shrinking. That's an analogy I've heard quite a lot in politics nowadays. Throughout the few past presidential cycles, we've seen a lot of renewed interest in labor and labor issues. I'll let the listeners try and decide who's talking the talk and who's walking the walk on that end. But we've had a lot of renewed interest in labor. We've had auto and railroad strikes, an effort to reshore and bring manufacturing back, and some successful unionization votes, Starbucks most prominently. In terms of policy, what have you seen that has made you feel hopeful in addressing the inequality aspect that we've talked about, but also in addressing the decreasing labor share of income?
Well, that's a good question. I think there are quite a few things to unpack there. I think um, let's I guess start with some of the facts on the ground. When when you conduct research, all economic research is has a lag. Right? It takes time for that data to be collected, and then it takes even longer for that data to be analyzed and published, and so on and so forth. And so, pretty much all of my research focuses on a period prior to 2020, right? And so what that means, therefore, is that my view of, say, the past 5 years, or what we can think of not so much as history, but current events, comes more from sort of anecdotal experience, understanding what has happened in the past, and then staying up with current events. One thing that I think is quite remarkable is that while there is, of course, this narrative that the parties are more polarized today than they ever have been in the past, that may be true. I'm not a political scientist, and there's probably a million different ways that you can measure political polarization. But one area where I feel like there has been a reduction in polarization, and indeed even a convergence in views, is this opinion that inequality has become excessive. Right now, traditionally, particularly economists, free market economists, some 30 years ago, you referenced Milton Friedman, would say that, well, inequality is just a natural consequence of the free market, and so forth, and that all countries should pursue free market reform, and so on and so forth. And I think that what you've begun to see on both sides of the political spectrum is a rejection, if not a questioning of that particular view. So when it comes to policy, right, the reality is that people's sentiments do not translate into policy as seamlessly as we would hope, right? And ultimately, what my opinion is that politics is somewhat hopelessly influenced and marred by political money and donations, and particularly from large corporations. We've talked a lot about labor markets and labor market regulation, but when we or labor market institutions, but of course, when we're talking about the labor share, it is equally as important looking at prices and the prices that companies are able to charge, and we have seen increasingly monopolization of large aspects of the U.S. economy. I do think that it is interesting that there is this issue of antitrust that has at least nominally been picked up as an area of focus by both parties. Right now, whether antitrust legislation actually materializes and is passed and implemented, I think we are still quite a ways away from there. Lobbying in the United States is well, we should never underestimate its power and its ability to influence people's votes at the last minute.
I don't know
Um,
if you saw, but last night Google won well, I don't want to say they won, but in terms of the like penalty decision, they had a major victory in that they avoided a breakup, a spinoff, divestment, things like that. So it does seem like, at least legally, there's been a little bit of a retreat of stronger antitrust enforcement.
exactly. Yeah, and I think that is just one example of many examples where the antitrust movement is, in some cases, two steps forward and one step back, which does mean progress, but I purposely put those around. But it's that progress is certainly slow. I think as well an encouraging sign, like I said, is that we've seen instances of strong wage growth, particularly in, let's call it, blue collar occupations following the pandemic. Now, this, my opinion, has more to do with demographics and kind of long term trends of people pursuing higher education and then careers in say a corporate setting as opposed to trades or manufacturing and so forth, right? And so it's hard to say how long that those reversals will occur, but it does sort of seem that the reality is, right, is that while we have an economy that has shifted from people being employed in manufacturing to people being employed in services, people still consume lots of goods. They're not just consuming services. And so as that, as so long as that reality holds, there's still going to be a demand for people working in those goods producing segments of the economy. So I think supporting that wage growth and ensuring that wage growth doesn't backslide is of course I think a very important initiative. Unionization efforts have picked up steam. I think that increasingly people are recognizing that unions can be an important means for workers to advocate for themselves. That doesn't just exist in the traditional sense of unionization within manufacturing, but increasingly with digital technology, people can coordinate and collaborate, right, and coordinate their efforts through digital means. But again, a lot of unions' strength rely on history, right? The history of unionization, and so it is quite difficult to establish a history or tradition of unionization or collective bargaining in areas of the economy where it either hasn't traditionally existed or that those industries are just new, right? Thinking specifically about, say, the tech sector. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
And are there any policies that have made you a little bit more concerned than hopeful?
Yes, I mean, there are certainly, I would say, more policies that make me concerned than hopeful these days. I worry greatly about the U.S. policy when it comes to tariffs. Now, I am not a say free market economist, but in the vein of Milton Friedman, and I think that probably that those policies of globalization were pursued without full and careful consideration of the consequences for American workers. But I also fear that the current policies of tariffs are being pursued without full and careful consideration of the impact on American consumers. And the reality is that American consumers and American workers are the same people. So I don't necessarily believe that tariffs are a tool that should never be used. There are some economists that believe that is the case. I'm not one of them. I think tariffs, we can look to history to see examples of tariffs being used quite well as industrial policy to preserve or to protect nascent industries. But I worry that without a clear and concise goal of that tariff policy, that we can fall into a scenario of high cost to consumers, likely combined with a weakening or a continuingly weak labor market. Right, that is kind of an economist's worst case scenario. That the scenario of stagflation. So I would say in terms of policy, that is one of the greater concerns I have. It's also been disappointing that neither party has seemed willing or able to come up with tax reforms that will effectively redistribute the tax burden in a way that in my opinion, I believe that most people believe that it should operate, and in some cases think that it operates, but actually does not. Talking about things such as the lower rates on long-term capital gains tax, the disproportionate tax on middle-class wealth through the form of property tax as opposed to untaxed financial wealth, and so forth. But those kind of are all things that, again, in a democracy, take a very long time, and particularly in a democracy that is riddled with lobbying efforts, may never come to fruition.
I won't hold my breath on that. Yeah, you've touched upon a lot of different policies, and I hope that they can start to trend in the right direction. But as of right now, it does not at least feel that way. So, my final question that I ask all of our guests that come onto the show: if there is one thing about this world you could change, big or little, what would it be and why?
Hmm. This wasn't a question you alerted me to, so let me think about that.
Not to put you on the spot.
I I I am concerned. Maybe this is a little bit of a pie in the sky uh, um, thing that I would like to change. But whenever I teach economics, and particularly teaching undergrads, it all kind of accumulates towards this idea of consumption and growth and increased output and therefore greater material prosperity. My concern is that we are ignoring the fact that we live in a resource constrained world. I mean, of course, this is, I guess, in a way, something that is stated at the beginning of every intro to micro course, that we live in a resource constrained world. But I am fearful that we being people who have a recency bias or a bias towards the more immediate future, ignore the impacts that economic growth have on the environment. And I think that future generations certainly will pay for the decisions and the consumption that we do today. So in some ways, I'm fearful that the economics discipline as a whole, and I'm not talking about all economists, there are economists that do great work on this type of thing, are overlooking maybe one of the, if not the most existential problems that will face humanity, and that is our impact on our world. So if I could change anything, I guess I would change people's willingness to engage in that topic and to figure out a better way forward.
No, I think that's a good place to end. It's hard to maintain equilibrium when the sky is falling. So, Dr.
Exactly.
Ansel Schiavone, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today. It was great talking to you.
Thank you very much, Nathan.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Henry George School podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope it made you think. If you'd like to learn more about our research and policy tools, check out hgsss.org. That's hgsss.org. If you'd like to listen to our content as soon as it's published, subscribe to our show. If you like the show, please leave us a rating, review, or even share it with a friend. It goes a long way. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.